Good evening, everyone. Thank you again for joining me for this last and final session. And we've covered a lot of ground so far. The last 2 weeks, we focused on the Quranic portrayal of Mary. And then in the second class session, we talked about how Mary is depicted in the sayings and teachings of Prophet Muhammad, who are so key, have normative value for Muslim belief and practice. So this is foundational, like I said, the Quran and the sayings and the teachings of Prophet Muhammad for our understanding on Mary. And tonight, I wanted to simply offer a little bit of more personal reflection from my own view as a Muslim woman, and then hopefully we'll wrap up. So our game plan for tonight follows a similar format. I'll look at some of the questions and comments you've raised from last week. And then we'll go into the main segment, which is a more of an exegetical approach, a commentary on Mary from my own perspective. And then you will have a chance again to talk in the small groups and process a little bit together and exchange your ideas and thoughts. And then we'll come back in the main group. Now, my dear colleague Angela, she taught me the one who has put these beautiful slides together and has been patiently working with me behind the scenes, who curated these beautiful slides. She found out that daffodils are a symbol of Mary, which I didn't know. Now I even love them more. In Germany, we call daffodils Osterglocken, Easter bells, because they have this beautiful connection to the season of resurrection, the season of spring. And so I hope anytime you see daffodils, these beautiful yellow daffodils, you'll be remembering this class, and it connects you to all the things you've learned in this class. And you hopefully have some tangible thing to remember Mary. And the way the daffodils are also looking down, I've learned in the Christian tradition, means that this is how Mother Mary watches all over us and looks down upon us from heaven. So I thought it's a beautiful way to also capture that. And Angela also put these beautiful geometric patterns here on the right upper corner, again, symbolizing the daffodil and the beauty of Mary, peace be upon her. So last week, some of you asked whether Mary and Jesus are Jewish. I mean, that's not a term that appears in the Quran, but yes, Mary and Jesus are from the children of Israel. The Quran calls them members of the Beni Israel. So Mary and Jesus in the Quran are affirmed to come from that prophetic lineage, from the Davidic line, and they are sent to the Beni Israel, to the Israelites. So yes, Mary weaves the beauties of the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition and the Muslim tradition together. And that's very important to keep that in mind. And the Quran always talks about and affirms that. So this is something that I wanted to lift up. There were also some questions regarding angels and the jinn and the devil. These are supernatural beings that are, majority of Muslims have a strong belief and affirmation in these supernatural beings. They are different category of supernatural beings. Angels, according to Islamic theology, do not have free will. Jinn, which are created out of smokeless fire, as the Quran describes and the prophetic teachings describe, have free will, have free choice. Satan, in the Quranic narrative, appears as a jinn, was very pious, very religious, very devout, and was elevated to the rank of the angels. Now, I don't want to take too much time here talking about the role of Satan and Shaitan, but I have added some additional resources for those who are interested, and they will be in the follow-up. email, and you can dive in and educate yourself some more. But I want to give center stage to Mary because she is our main figure of focus. And there was also a question whether Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, refers to himself as being close to Jesus. Yes, he, like we said in the statements, in these sacred narrations, he describes himself as being near to Jesus, as being a paternal brother. And so Jesus and Prophet Muhammad and all messengers of God, in that case, are described as servants of God, as messengers of God, who are chosen by God. So we need to, just to stress that here. And then so what we've also learning is we use same terms, same words, but we have different understandings of that term or different conceptions of the same term. So Muslims, when they talk about scripture or use the word prophet or angel or devil, there is a whole different theological understanding behind it. I want to just flag that because we are not always, when we use the same terms, that we're always having the same understandings. Just to flag that as you are continuing your interreligious learning. So I've named this segment for tonight, this final session, A Muslim Woman's Commentary on Mary, simply because I'm just one of many. These are the books that I read in the languages that I'm familiar with, in English, in Turkish, in Deutsch, in German. And there are also a number of Arabic books on Mary. But I wanted to just feature those because this is just gives you an idea of how Muslim women, specifically Muslim women, are interested in the figure of Mary, have written about the figure of Mary, have offered their own exegetical voices on Mary. So mine is simply a little drop and adding my very narrow, my very limited vantage point to this commentary tradition. And so I think it's important that, like I said in the first beginning of the class, we can never do justice to this gigantic, spiritual, sacred, holy figure whose legacy have endured the centuries. So any commentary that comes out is never a final one. Any voice, so mine is only one Muslim woman's voice, my own very, like I said, limited perspective on Mary, but coming from my own particular context, my own personal reading of her and how she has guided me and informed my own spiritual journey, my own relationship with God, and continues to do so for me and many other Muslim women and Muslims, not just Muslim women, but similarly Muslim men are interested because we know that the Quran is a universal discourse addressing all humankind. So she's not just interesting to a Muslim woman, but I wanted to lift up the voices of Muslim women who have written about her, who have thought about her, because Muslim women are not often highlighted in the theological discourse. Now, like I said, I situate myself in a very particular context. I was born and raised as a child of Muslim immigrants from Turkey. And these are pictures from my hometown in Germany, which is a Catholic state, the state of Rheinland-Pfalz in Germany. So as you know, the Germany is divided or is, has different states. And I grew up in Rheinland-Pfalz. And Rheinland-Pfalz is a predominantly Catholic diocese. So when you walk throughout my hometown, the city of Mainz, you will encounter so many depictions of Mary, so many statues of Mary that are just sitting on these buildings throughout the beautiful city of Old Town, which is also, by the way, the city where the Bible was printed first by Johannes Gutenberg, who invented the printing machine, or who advanced it rather. So I grew up with her. I mean, as a Muslim girl, as a Muslim woman, living in a German Catholic state, she was always present. I walking in my neighborhood. So I'm have that kind of very deep relationship with her. And these are pictures from, like I said, in Turkey, or Turkey as we now say. from the shrine that I showed you last time, the house of Mother Mary, or we call her Maryam in Turkish. And there she was. There I visited her again. When I go pray in the Hagia Sophia, in the Hagia Sophia, there she sits and watches over us. So very present throughout my life. And then, of course, the famous Muslim production, I linked this for you. It's a very famous movie on Mary, the Holy Mary, from a Muslim perspective, which is quite popular throughout the Muslim world. First was produced in Iran and then has made it so, is widely viewed throughout the Muslim world. And so I've linked this for you too with the English version. If you're interested in a Mary movie that tells the Muslim narrative. So Muslims are, introduced to Mary, have grown up with Mary throughout their lives. Like many Muslims, I read the story of Mary daily. I engage with the Quran daily. But I'm mentioning this because I come to the story of the Mary, or the Mary narrative, from this very particular background. I have read the Quran always with an interreligious lens, simply because I grew up, I was raised in Germany with different religious communities around me, primarily Christian. And I was always interested in what the Quran has to say about the audiences, the people, the communities that I'm growing up. So that's just to say what is my context and how I approach the Mary narrative in the Quran. So, like the majority of Muslims, I affirm that the Quran is the eternal word of God. Now, what does it mean for the practice of exegesis? It means that any human interpretation is always limited and not final. So if the Quran is the eternal word of God, if it's an infinite ocean without shore, then any kind of exegetical voice is always limited and never final. And that was always the history of Quranic exegesis, which affirmed that any interpretation is never the final and the last one. There was always a culture of healthy dialogue and healthy disagreement. There were different interpretations sometimes, right? So that's very important to keep in mind, because commentaries will be produced, and they've been produced since the emergence of Islam. And all scholars will always say, I tried my best to offer my own limited interpretation, but my interpretation is not final. Now, anybody who says that had a very fundamentalist or extremist approach to the Quran, because the Quran basically states that only only God knows the eternal meaning of the text. However, that does not mean that we are not invited to engage with the text. We are invited to bring in reason and our own context and try to engage reason with revelation, right? So it has never meant that nobody is encouraged to find meaning and wisdom in this divine discourse. In fact, the opposite was the case, with that important caveat that no interpretation is the final one. So I wanted to just preface that before we dive into this, exegetical exercise. What is also important, any interpretation has to be guided by Prophet Muhammad's holistic teaching and message. It's very important. He is the living interpreter who shows the borders and boundaries of exegesis. Any interpretation that is not in line with the prophetic or the Muhammadan message, or somehow contradicts his life and legacy, then we have an issue here, and that interpretation needs to be questioned. So very important that Prophet Muhammad is the one who shows and navigates the interpretation, because Muslims affirm that he is the mouthpiece of God and that he applied the Quranic message first into his own life. Now we've seen various statements how he approached Mary and what he said about Mary. These are very important statements by Prophet Muhammad, and they are always considered in the exegetical tradition. So just to stress that any interpretation also has in the background, always actually in the forefront, Prophet Muhammad's engagement with other religious communities, his understanding of the living text, his understanding of the Quranic narratives. How did he understand and how did he apply the Quranic content to his relationship with other religious communities who were also existent at the time? Now that's very important. I also, like Muslims, I come to the Quran affirming it as a universal discourse. The Quran does not address itself simply to Muslims. The Quran is talking to humankind, to humanity, to Jewish communities, to Christian communities, to people of who do not embrace a faith in God, to the non-religious. So in that regard, the Quran also invites interpretation that also has that audience in mind, realizing what are some of the universal themes that we can detect and that also are important not just for Muslims, but all humankind. So that explains why I do this interreligious exercise, because I come to the text from an interreligious lens. Like I said, the Quran is deeply dialogical and relational. It's interested in stepping into a relationship with other communities, religious and non-religious, and listening carefully to the theological claims, to the not the claims of people who are not believers, and taking them up and engaging with them in healthy ways. So deeply important here. So the Quran emerged in the Near Eastern context, which explains also that it claims that it has a sibling relationship with other religious communities, that it claims that it comes from that same divine source, that there is a chain of revelation, and the prophets and messengers of God are basically delivering the same primary content. There's one challenge that we all face as scriptural communities, or any scriptural community always faces. It's a spiritual challenge, I would say. The Quran is Quranic Arabic is a deeply rich language, and it often invites for different interpretations, various meanings. And we, in scriptural studies, we like to use the term eisegesis and exegesis. So the spiritual challenge is, am I reading into the text or am I drawing meaning out of the text? So if somebody is not careful, the spiritual challenge would mean, do I sincerely seek God's voice, or what is the divine meaning here, and put myself and my ego and my lower ego and my interest, my selfish interest, my selfish agenda aside, and am I really listening carefully and openly to the divine voice? And in that process, am I being changed and transformed, and also take that up to change my community in healthy ways? So there's always a danger to approach the text and offer an interpretation that can be destructive or constructive. So how do I basically derive meaning that becomes uplifting, that becomes life-giving, that becomes constructive? Or am I reading something into the text to justify a certain selfish agenda, a certain political agenda, a certain, worldly interest, whatever it is? So that is, just like to keep something in mind when we think about, eisegesis and exegesis. The challenge is, I have a preconceived notion or a certain interest, and I'm trying to justify by a religious discourse, by a religious language, or am I sincerely seeking out something out of the text and then as a result being transformed? So what are some themes that I'm able to see in the Mary narrative in the Quran? Now we've encountered Mary first through her mother, Hannah or Anne, as she's known in the Christian tradition. Um, so I think, and all the interpretation that I offer is backed up by other passages from the Quran. So I'm reading the Mary narrative holistically, meaning that I, as somebody who reads the Quran daily, like many Muslims, I'm immersed in the Quranic worldview. I see many themes that are reiterated throughout the Quran in the Mary narrative represented. So what I'm offering here are things that I see that are already mentioned throughout the Quran, but they are only stressed or highlighted more in her portrayal or in her own particular story. So, one theme that I see represented in the Quranic narrative of Mary or the Quranic portrayal is that she really challenges our notion of causality, something that I already alluded to in some of my reflections. For example, we see that, when she's in her private prayer room, in her sanctuary, in the mihrab, that she reminds Prophet Zechariah that God is not bound by any limitation, that she has received those miraculous blessings by God alone directly, which of course is a miracle as such. But when Zechariah asks her, who sent you these blessings? Who sent you these out of season fruits? And is puzzled, she simply says, God sends to whomever he wills. He doesn't have to abide by certain laws. He doesn't have to abide by certain causes or by certain rules. He is, in fact, the lawgiver. He is the one who establishes the laws in nature. He is the one who gives directly and sustains human beings and nourishes human beings and all creation. He is the provider. He's a sustainer. He is a nourisher. Now, this is, of course, more stressed in the story of Mary, in her response. And so throughout the Quranic narrative of Mary, you'll encounter this whole notion about challenging causality. God is not compartmentalized. God is not bound by certain reasons or causes. God is not, he has no restrictions by any limitations, or human limitations do not apply to him. So the affirmation of radical oneness of God, right? We see that very strongly in the story of Mary, how she, as this young child, already teaches Prophet Zechariah important lessons. Then, of course, sometimes she is somewhat puzzled and questions Archangel Gabriel, says, how can I have a son if no one has touched me? How can I have a child? And so even there, God reminds her, this is easy for me. I'm not, I'm not enslaved by causes. I don't need causes to operate. So as somebody, like I said, who was born and raised in Germany, went to a secular education, lived mostly in a secular society, and operates in a world in which is marked by a secular climate mostly, because God is not at the center of the conversation. God is at the margins. He's not mentioned. He doesn't show up in the media, or he doesn't show up in books, or he doesn't show up in the discourse, or when we talk about the weather. So God is very much marginal. And the idea that the causes have power over us, right, is something that the Quran challenges. And of course, with Mary, we see that radically challenged. She is born as the daughter through a woman who is at advanced age, and she has trouble conceiving, her mother, Hannah. And then Prophet Zechariah, when he receives a response, he is already at an advanced age. And then and there, when he receives a response from Mary, he says, of course, God can create whenever he wants, and he's not bound by any limitations. So here in the story, we see over and over Jesus being born without a father, Prophet Zechariah having a child, John the Baptist, at advanced age, with an old wife. Um, Hannah conceiving at an advanced age, and then the miraculous blessings, and then the date tree who is miraculously again offering fresh dates out of season. So, and then the Jesus child who is speaking out of the cradle. So these are definitely very, very interesting elements that challenge our world of causality, because this is not something that we're used to as people who are operating within a world of causality. So that's something that comes always throughout the Quran, always reaffirming the radical oneness of God, that uh, we are, of course, in this world invited to function through causes, to operate in a world of causes, but to always affirm that causes have no power over us. They are not able to create. They are unconscious, lifeless, blind, deaf forces. So that's why the Quran over and over says, He is the one who sends down rain from the sky, from which you drink, and by which plants grow for your cattle to graze. With it he grows for you grain, olives, palms, wines, and all kinds of other crops. There truly is a sign in this for those who reflect. So over and over, the Quran points to the cosmic book, to actually all these extraordinary things that are happening always throughout our daily lives, but we don't pay attention, or the art of noticing is lost. We assign power to the causes. We say the cloud is sending the rain, or the earth has produced, these various blessings. And this is something that the Quran challenges. And I think the ultimate challenge for a believer in modern society, as a person of faith who operates in a world of causality, that kind of climate can get to the person, and we can think that causes have power over us. And so ultimately, the Quran always goes back to also making the point of the resurrection, that people are questioning, are doubting that the resurrection and the judgment day will happen. So over and over, we hear these things saying, God is not bound by causes. He is above, he is the lawgiver. He is the giver of natural laws. He is the one who establishes. And the causes or causality are a veil to the person of faith. And the ultimate test of faith is to be able to see who is operating behind the veil of causes. And that doesn't mean to fall into a fatalistic mode and say, God is taking care of everything, I don't need to do my part. That's not what the Muslim perspective here is. But to always know that God is in ultimate control. He is omnipotent, He is powerful, and He is the one who established the world of causes. So we have, for example, here always these statements say it is God who gives you life, then causes you to die, and then He gathers you all to the day of resurrection, of which there is no doubt, though most people do not comprehend. And then, of course, the Quran takes up this ultimate question. They will say, who will bring us back? Right? The one who created you the first time, says the Quran. Basically ridiculing the question, who do you think you were the first time? You were lifeless, unconscious, dead matter, a drop of fluid. And so it's easy for God to create the human being the second time. If it would be hard, it would be the first time it would be hard. So the response, the Quranic response to this question of how can I be resurrected if I'm dead bone? Well, you were dead before, lifeless, unconscious matter. It's easy for God to recreate and resurrect you and bring consciousness back into you, and life, and the power of volition, and power of memory, and the power of feeling and emotion, and all of this. These are extraordinary in a world that has marginalized God to the margins. So that's something that the Quran wants to challenge. The story of Mary is always challenging, causality, and interestingly, children have a lot to teach us here. And so another thing that I feel that Mary is, at least for me personally, that she definitely conveys is always her complete embodiment of hope. I mean, we have followed her story when she, when she receives the news, the divine decree that she is going to give birth to a fatherless child. I mean, in a society in which this is considered an absolute scandal, and then we see her being in complete anguish and helplessness. Um, her weakness and her emotional despair, her mental state. I mean, she just cries out and wishes she could die. I mean, pregnancy in itself is already scary territory. It's an emotionally and physically daunting experience. But then to do it alone, to do it in such a social climate, to do it fatherless, to do it in a way that is considered as scandal and as adultery or fornication, with maybe the outcome to be stoned or killed, and then to be in the desert, to be in isolation and no support, to be in complete exhaustion. I mean, we can imagine her her utter anguish. And there are many people, I mean, many of us face that point where we can find ourselves having reached the lowest of low, where we feel there's just no resolution. I mean, there is just no hope. This is the end, and where we feel an utter darkness and despair, and we can hear that in her pain, in her suffering, and it, I mean, we also see in her how she leans into the uncertainty and lets go of control and just expresses her sadness, her vulnerability, her neediness. So there's a lot going on here, and I think these are some of the universal themes and experiences that can relate to us. I can certainly see myself in her. Um, you know, Reaching your lowest of low and being in such a desolate state. But then also she invites us to challenge despair, right? And in her, we see also that God always was present in her. I mean, with her, that God has never left her side. Hope is a big theme, of course, in the Quranic world, which is, of course, something that we always consider as a main virtue. But she embodies that as well. Like we see when she reaches her end, that God comes to her rescue, and God's compassionate presence never left her side, and that she is able, within the pain and the suffering, to also express hope. And so those themes, also those the theme of hope, right, which we see in Mary, is very much affirmed in the Quran, because this is a human experience. This is a universal experience that every one of us will sometimes be shaken in their lives and feel they cannot get out of that darkness or that despair or that painful place. And so God comes to the rescue, have never left her side. Um, for some, she represents the refugee woman in the desert with her child facing starvation, facing death. For some, she represents the single mother, the single parent who is in utter despair and doesn't know how to provide for herself and her child. So there's a lot that she embodies. She embodies the desperation, the hopelessness, but also she embodies hope. She is the one that then shows us that God is there to then provide for her, to comfort her, to listen to her. He was always her most intimate companion. And so I found these kind of elements in her story very moving, deeply soothing, comforting, such a cure for the heart that sometimes goes through these very emotional, heavy times. And so the Quran affirms, say, nothing will ever befall us except what God has destined for us. He is our protector. So in God, let the believers put their trust. So she is an embodiment of utter trust, so absolute trust. leaning into uncertainty. And into uncertainty is not an easy thing to do, because uh, this idea of losing control or letting go of control, right? We human beings, we want to be in control and we want to plan and program, but there are moments in our lives where we just don't have control, right? And so she teaches us that in leaning in uncertainty, there's also possibility. It's not always a dark place. It's also a place where through pain and suffering, you can birth wisdom. And that's what she does. She births this divine wisdom into the world, the word of God into the world, and transforms history and humankind. So it is often through pain that the greatest transformations, personal transformations, and the personal elevation of a person is achieved. And the Quran, certainly for Muslims, always makes clear that this world is not all that there is, that this world is not a place of entertainment or satisfaction or absolute happiness. So we see that here in the last verse, God will certainly test you with a touch of fear and famine and loss of property, loss of life and crops. Now, this is a heavy statement in the Quran, that God will test people of faith in this life. But then again, give good news to those who patiently endure. Those who say, when afflicted with a calamity, we belong to God and to him we shall return. These will be given blessings and mercy from their Lord, and it is they who are rightly guided. So Muslims are operating with the belief, or very much in approaching this world as a place of trials, also as a place of growth, spiritual growth, intellectual growth, moral growth. For growth to happen, for transformation to happen and occur, certain things are, coming your way. And so this um, quote spoke to me in that regard. This is a quote from Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, who is a Swiss-German scholar who spent a lot with people who were dying and accompanying them on their death journey. And she has, her whole research is about death, dying, and grief. And she says the most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depth. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and a deep, loving concern. Beautiful people do not just happen. So the idea that this world is a place where human beings are sometimes going through very tough and rough experiences, just like Mary, who is faced with a very difficult, daunting task, not knowing what God's plan is, radically challenging societal structures, right? I mean, but then out of that struggle, she's able to come out of it, and we see her true beauty. So human nature, human potential comes to shine through struggle, through loss, through suffering, sometimes through defeat, which are not pleasant experiences. These are painful experiences. But through Mary, we see that in her pain, she is able to embody and display hope and compassion and gentleness. Her beauty really comes to shine within these kind of struggles. In the story of Mary, I also see a theme that is always repeated in the Quran, affirming the spiritual equality of all. Now, remember, her mother Anne or Hannah wanted a son, because at that time the temple, the sacred temple, was only accessible to men. So she is completely surprised when when God blesses her with Mary, and saying, "This is a girl. I mean, how am I going to put a girl into the sacred temple, which is only accessible to a certain male hierarchy?" Right? So But then we have this beautiful voice in the Quran saying God fully knew that she had given birth to a girl. He wanted a girl. He wanted Mary to enter the sacred temple and be involved in, sacred knowledge and sacred service and participate in these holy services. So I think it just lifts up what the Quran always reiterates, the spiritual equality of all human beings, that all human beings are born with a clean slate. Man and woman are spiritually, morally equal. I mean, spiritually equal in the regard that they have the same potential to come close to God, that they are both invited in that sacred service, that they are encouraged to participate in this quest for learning and sacred scholarship. So that is something that is affirmed and the Quran lifts up, and that this is not an exclusive terrain for only a certain group of people. So something that is absolutely stressed in the story of Mary is affirming the spiritual equality of both, of man and woman, and that women are invited, in fact encouraged, to participate in that sacred enterprise. So we see that in many verses of the Quran, O humankind, we created you all from a single man and a single woman and made you into races and tribes so that you should recognize one another. In God's eyes, the most honored of you are the ones most mindful of him, most conscious of him. God is all knowing, all aware. And there are other passages that lift up this spiritual equality again. For man and woman who are devoted to God, believing man and woman, obedient man and woman, truthful man and woman, steadfast man and woman, humble man and woman, charitable man and woman, fasting man and woman, chaste man and woman who remember God often, God has prepared forgiveness and a rich reward. So I think it's very clear that religion is not reserved for a very special few, but men and women are partners in that sacred quest, and they are both encouraged to partake in that. So I think in the story of Mary, affirming her womanhood, uplifting her womanhood, it's very important, especially in the time in which the Quran emerged. Remember, pre-Islamic Arabia, 7th century, was a time in which baby girls were killed. A female infanticide was common practice. Prophet Muhammad witnessed the killing of baby girls. Right? This is a abhorrent practice. But with the coming and the revelation of the Quran, this practice was outlawed. Now, sadly, let me just state here, as somebody who was born, raised in Germany, misogyny is all over the place. This is not something that only Muslims are wrestling with or that Muslims have a monopoly to deal with, but equal treatment of women is something that we are still striving for. Women are still not equal partners, spiritually equal partners in that regard. That is 21st century. I've lived in America, I lived in Germany, I lived in Turkey. I'm the proud mother of 2 daughters. I had 1 son, but I have seen the comments of people, pitying me because I had daughters, right? Not seeing daughters as valuable, not seeing daughters as having worth. And we see that also in societal and policy issues. Still, women are not receiving equal and fair pay for the same jobs. So when the Quran affirms womanhood, saying that God created man and woman spiritually equal, this needs to be reflected in societal norms, in the political realm, in the economic realm. Sadly, we are not there. Women all over the world struggle, right? Europe, the beacon of democracy and freedom of expression. There are many Muslim women who are denied entry into the workforce simply because they are Muslim, right? Or there are women who are not receiving fair pay simply because they are women. Muslim women couldn't participate in the Olympics because they're wearing a scarf, right? Mothers and women who do not have a chance to fully integrate themselves into the workforce. So certain policies in certain countries in which women and girls are still seen as inferior, as a dishonor, as a shame, right? The killing of baby girls is not something that only happened in 7th century Arabia. It still continues in many parts of the world. Baby girls being killed alive or being denied access to certain, opportunities, right? Like I said, as somebody who has been raised as a Muslim girl, I have experienced those things. And these are not just experiences of Muslim women, but we all, I'm sure, have experiences that speak to that. So I found it very empowering when I look back into the Quran and the prophetic teachings that challenge these norms, challenge these false cultural practices, right? And God says here, I mean, in the Quran, the divine voice, to God alone belongs the kingdom of the heavens and the earth. He creates whatever he wills. He blesses whoever he wills with daughters. The term here that is used is blesses. He blesses whoever he wills with daughters and blesses whoever he wills with sons, or grants both sons and daughters to whoever he wills, and leaves whoever he wills infertile. That also doesn't mean that a person who doesn't have children is somehow inferior spiritually. It just shows that it's God's will. And if it's God's will, it means it's beautiful. There is wisdom in it. If he decreed it that some people have sons and daughters, or some do not have children, that is all from God's will and is not something to label people as inferior or superior or somehow below. So I think these are very important statements in the Quran that show the direction that humankind has to take to ensure that the spiritual equality is reflected in our policy making, in our social practices all over the world, right? Whenever one of them, and this speaks to the still today, I think, still when somebody receives the news of a baby girl, they perceive it as a shame and dishonor. If they don't have a male heir, in many cultures and many customs, many cultures and societies, if you don't have a son, if you don't have a male heir, you're perceived as somehow inferior. And so the Quran refutes that, condemns this attitude. Whenever one of them is given the good news of a baby girl, his face grows gloomy as he suppresses his rage. He hides himself from the people because of the bad news he has received. Should he keep her in disgrace or bury her alive in the ground? Evil indeed is their judgment. The Quran condemns this evil practice. It condemns the disadvantages of women and girls. Right? So it's a challenge for Muslim societies and non-Muslim societies, like I said, to come to that and challenge this misogyny. What I also found very powerful in one of the chapters of the Quran, when the Quran talks about Judgment Day and all these like cosmic changes of how God will wrap up the stars and the sun and create all these cosmic changes, he will give agency and voice to the most marginalized being on this planet, which is the baby girl. It says on Judgment Day, when the baby girl buried alive is asked for what crime she was killed. Isn't that amazing? This is powerful, I think. For me here, it basically says the people who are silenced and marginalized, who are discriminated, who have been made voiceless, are being given a voice. The most vulnerable being on this planet is a baby girl. When you are born as a girl, you're already faced with multiple disadvantages. You already have certain barriers, obstacles to overcome. Now, what is powerful in the Quran, that God is a mighty defender of those who have been silenced, who have been oppressed, who have been marginalized, discriminated, who have been unjustly killed. It's powerful because here it says the baby girl will be asked, why was she killed? What was her crime? Because God created her as a girl. That killing her is a crime against God. Disadvantaging her is a crime, injustice against God. And anybody, right, anyone who disgraces vulnerable, marginal, or silenced, voiceless beings on this planet, especially baby girls, God says, I will give agency to her. On Judgment Day, she will speak. She will have a voice. It's very interesting, like how the Quran challenges certain societal norms and practices and these wrongdoings that are still going on up until today, the modern time, in all kinds of aspects of our societies. So in the story of Mary, who is the only woman mentioned by name in the Quran, who is uplifted as a woman, not because she is the mother of Jesus, but because of her own virtue, her own persona, her own spiritual character. She is trustful, she is truthful, she is being uplifted. It's her spiritual character that the Quran is interested, not that she is the mother of Jesus. That's also important, but it's Jesus who gains honor through her, because he is the son of an honorable person, of the most trustful, most righteous, most virtuous person, because God says he has chosen her. She is the most virtuous woman, he says, for all humankind. I mean, so we need to keep that in mind, that the Quran puts Mary center stage. Her voice is restored. Her spiritual persona and aura is the most important. And yes, she's also a mother. She's also a parent. And the Quran talks a lot about filial piety, how it's important to honor one's parents, but especially mothers, which till today you cannot put on your CV, because being a mother, or the most important maybe challenge and job in your life, if you are a mother, you know, your kids are constantly on your radar. You wake up, your first thought are your children, your last thought are your children. But this is not something that is still reflected in the policy making. Parenthood, motherhood is not something that you can put on your sleeve, or, you know, get a certificate or an award. Yes, we do have Mother's Day. We do have deep, love and veneration and respect for mothers. But it's, the workforce and society still does not reflect that kind of honor of parenthood. That is the most challenging, the most transformative and beautiful, a sacred duty, but also something that is challenging, and that is not something that is often openly acknowledged. So the Quran puts that also front to center, that she was a mother, yes, she was a parent, and that parents need to be honored, and that this honor needs to be reflected in all spheres of life, whether we talk about policy making or structuring workplaces in a way that supports parents so that they can juggle all these different tasks and can take care of their children. So I take these things in the story of Mary, very important elements that offer social criticism to all communities, right? So the Quran says we have commanded, it's a command, it's a very strong word, we have commanded people to be good to their parents. Their mothers carried them with strain upon strain, and it takes 2 years to wean them, the children. Give thanks to me and to your parents. So God mentions the parents next to him. It's very interesting. Give thanks to me and to your parents. All will return to me. But if the parents pressure you to associate with me, what you have no knowledge of, do not obey them. So there's an exception. If parents are telling the children not to, follow God and not to follow guidance and revelation, or if they do not embrace their faith, or do not encourage the children to live a life in devotion to God, then there's a limit. Do not obey them. Still keep their company in this world courteously, but still the Quran commands the believer to treat them with respect and follow the way of those who turn to me in devotion. then to me you will all return, and then I will inform you of what you used to do. And the second passage also speaks to that. Your Lord has commanded that you should worship none but him, and that you be kind to your parents. If either or both of them reach old age with you, say no word that shows impatience with them, and do not be harsh with them, but speak to them respectfully, and lower your wing in humility towards them in kindness, and say, Lord, have mercy on them, just as they cared for me when I was little. So we see in the story of Mary that uplifting of motherhood, how Jesus protects her, speaks on behalf of her, how he defends her, how he, how he basically stresses that she was always a truthful, honest woman, that she never lied or fabricated any lie, and restoring also her honor and also showing her respect. So that's also something that comes up. The last thing, I put that up because these are very interesting inscriptions. You all know this is, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And when the Muslims entered the city of Jerusalem, I think 638, I believe, very, very early, they were ruling on Jerusalem, or were ruling Jerusalem for nearly 450 years. And this was one major building that I think Caliph Abdul Malik built. So the second caliph was a very close companion, Caliph Omar, who was a close companion of Prophet Muhammad, and the closest, one of the closest friends and companions who conquered the city of Jerusalem. And then for 450 years, it was under Muslim rule. Now, the inscriptions are very interesting here because Muslims put up these passages from the Quran, and I've linked it for you here. You can click on it later and then read in detail what is stated here. All these Quranic passages about Jesus and Mary, right? Now, for 450 years, this was under Muslim rule, so for Muslims, when they look back at the story of Mary or engage with the story of Mary and Jesus, for them, this did not mean to go, because of the theological differences, to go and exterminate everyone who was there, or engage in some kind of mass killing, or, annihilate difference or religious diversity. Because they knew that in the story of Mary and the other Quranic passages, there's always the affirmation of sameness, the same source, the same divine origin, that these messengers and prophetic figures are sent by God. But also there's a challenge, I think, in the story of Mary to challenge these unhealthy attitudes towards difference. So the Quran affirms sameness, but has also, like you already seen, very unique approaches and beliefs towards Jesus and Mary, right? And so it wants to maintain this kind of healthy tension. And so when Omar, the Caliph Omar, entered the city in 638, he entered into agreement with the Christians. It's called the Omar Pact or agreement. And Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived there for 450 years. Now, why I'm saying this? Because oftentimes, in the popular media, we are thinking about the Muslim villain and the terrorist and the radical, and expansion with Islam happened with the sword and everybody was killed. That's a gross misreading of history. Here's the archaeological evidence, the historical evidence that shows that these churches and synagogues remained intact. They were kept under Muslim rule safe. And Muslims did not understand these verses to mean, because they think differently and believe differently about Jesus and Mary, now that gives us justification to go and kill them and annihilate them and exterminate them. That is not what we are seeing. We are seeing affirming sameness, points of connection, and challenging these unhealthy attitudes towards difference. Because when you look at these different passages of the Quran, for Muslims, it's very key to understand that difference and diversity was divinely willed. It was the will of God that diversity exists. Now look at these passages. Those who have been driven unjustly from their homes only for saying our Lord is God. If God did not repel some people by means of others, many monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques where God's name is much invoked would have been destroyed. It's very interesting, right? So God's name is mentioned in churches, synagogues, mosques, and monasteries. And there's no allowance for Muslims to go and destroy these religious sites. This is absolutely, from Islamic law perspective, legally prohibited, right? It's condemned. And that's why Muslims, for the most part in history, had amicable relationships. Now, this was the case of Jerusalem. You have the Ottoman Empire for 600 years. There were no borders, no high walls. People traveled throughout the empire, Jews, Christians, Muslims. That doesn't mean that the past was always romantic and nice. There were certainly tensions and conflicts in any human relationship. But the history was not marked by hostility and enmity towards religious difference. Quite the contrary. This is why we have churches in Syria, churches in still Turkey, in Spain, all these religious sites in North Africa. They've not been destroyed by Muslims, because we see in figures like Mary and Jesus that there is some sameness and point of connection. And so Muslims then were careful to respect these points of connections, yet at the same time, not negotiating or not, changing their theological claims. So they did not compromise on their theological beliefs. They did not cater to a certain audience and said, okay, we want to get along, and that's why let's change our theological beliefs and religious convictions. No, they were living in that healthy disagreement and healthy difference. And so the Quran speaks to this, and speaks certainly in the story of Mary, that there are different conceptions about Mary, right, and Jesus, yet at the same time, there are similarities. And so the Quran says here, another of his signs is the creation of the heavens and earth, and the diversity of your languages and colors. There truly are signs in this for those who know. And had your Lord so willed, if it would be God's wish, all people on earth would have certainly believed, every single one of them. Would you then force people to become believers? So for Muslims, the experience of forcefully converting people, or forcefully and evangelizing, or regarding others who are religiously different as savages or barbaric people, was not the case. They had these agreements, political alliances, and for the most part tried to live alongside each other. Now, this is in our own backyard. This is the Maryam Islamic Center in Marriottsville. This is this is the Maryam Mosque in Sugar Land, Texas. And this is the Mosque of Jesus, Son of Mary in New York. So you see how Muslims are taking these points of connections and wanting to affirm the sameness, the same divine origins, this kind of prophetic sibling relationship, and not seeing these differences as a justification to go and harm others who are having different theological beliefs or religious beliefs. So I think we see that here in the United States. There are 4 to 5 million Muslims currently, and they don't read the Quranic narrative of Mary, meaning, those are all the infidels and people who are not agreeing with us, and we need to have a type of hostile relationship. That is not the experience that we are seeing on the ground. So I wanted to also bring that back here locally. This is something, a very interesting, segment from a movie that I've linked for you. You can watch it on your own, because we want to give some time for small groups. But you see in this encounter between Christians and Muslims, when Muslims emigrated to what is now Ethiopia or Eritrea. At that time, it was Christian Abyssinia, how the Christian king and the Christian community embraces these Muslim refugees. But it's very interesting that in this encounter, the story of Mary is mentioned and recited, and how the Christian leader response to that. I called it Mary to the rescue. So when he hears the story of Mary in the Quran, he sees these points of connection, and then he's willing to embrace these early Muslim refugees who were, I believe, in the 7th century, migrated to Abyssinia because of persecution. So we have time now for some group discussion. So let's give it until 25. I think 15 minutes, 12 minutes. So the last one, please disregard because we don't have time to watch this little video clip. You can watch that on your own. I encourage you to do it. It's a very nice, segment that shows us how the story of Mary has informed a Muslim relationship with Christians. So those are the things, my own limited, narrow commentary on Mary, what I come to understand, what are my takeaways. How does she speak to you? How do you personally relate to her? What are some themes that you found, oh wow, that resonated? So I'd like for you to engage in your small group conversation for until 8:25, and then hopefully we'll come back and then wrap up the session. Thank you so much. So the last question, I mean, we've reached the end, bittersweet. And this is our one of the final moments. There's something, little pieces that I still wanted to share, want you to take away. I hope I was able to convey a little bit about the Muslim Mary, the Quranic Mary. These are some segments that I also wanted to share. When you hover over your slides, you can always click on them later when you receive the follow-up email. These are further as we approach the holy season of Christmas. I hope you'll remember that Muslims equally are also taking this as an occasion to think more about Mary, to think more about Jesus, to think about their spiritual legacies, and that Muslims have a deep love and admiration and connection to Mary. I hope that I was able to convey that. This is the Muslim Christmas song by a local Muslim artist who lives here in Maryland Drive. It's interesting because there we see already these kind of connections, and when it's December 24th, the Christmas time, a lot of Muslims actually take it as an occasion to attend spiritual retreats, to have reflections and seminars or webinars about Mary and Jesus. So I just wanted to share this with you, and always curious to know what is one thing you learned today as we wrap up this final session. And I saw there were some questions. One question particularly as you're typing your answer. One thing you've learned today, let me know. Always nice to get some feedback. But there was a question about if Muslims think about God in he terms or in gender terms. And I think that we are always confronted with the limitations of language, or especially the English language. There are many languages who don't even have a pronoun. Like in Turkish, there is no he or she, or in other languages as well, Finnish, I believe, too. So for Muslims, God is not perceived as a gender, and that's very early on taught to children, that God is beyond his creation, that he's completely other than his creation. And there's a certain way to teach Muslim children, and Muslims have a very unique approach about learning about God and his divine nature. So gender terms or gender pronouns are always problematic. We don't have that kind of discussion or controversy or theological discourse in the Islamic tradition. So that's just to put it out there, but I will look up for some follow-up resources. Yes, there are mosques that are named after Maryam. Thank you. That's wonderful. It means a lot that you have gained a new view on Mary. I hope you have a richer appreciation of Mary. That's what I love about this interreligious learning, that it always gives me a greater appreciation about these shared figures. and that baby girls are gifts from God. I love learning about how they will be protected and uplifted at Judgment Day, since they're innocent souls. And I think it's not just baby girls, but if we think about any member in the society or a member in our communities who is voiceless, who is marginalized, who has been discriminated, I think the action here, or the Quranic action that is um, highlighted, I believe, is to bring those, be a voice for the voiceless, trying to bring those who are perceived to be at the margins into the center and have them have a seat at the table, and be that ally in that regard. The quotes from the Quran about the plight of baby girls were very moving, and the discussion. Thank you, appreciate that. I love the various themes you have seen in Mary's story. I really hope to look a little deeper. Like I said, yes, the commentary, there's no final verdict on Mary. There's no final commentary on Mary. I think there are so many other themes that I see in her, but I had to condense myself. It's always a challenge. I have so many thoughts that are whirling in my brain, but then I'm like, oh, I can't put them all on the slides, but I hope I can share them with you in the future. So we've reached our time together, but hopefully not the end of our interreligious learning. There will be many more opportunities in the future, God willing. I hope to see some of you next week at the in-person optional session. And if you leave the meeting, I think my colleague set it up that way that there will be a short Zoom survey, a little survey where if you could give us a little feedback, what you liked about this course, what you would like to see in the future, that would be much appreciated. And also my colleague, Christine Krieger, reminded me that we have still spots in our congregational fellowship program. She's the director of that congregational fellowship. If you are a member of any congregation, a lay member, a clergy member, and you are interested in building relationships and learning together and building a more interreligious network, the congregational fellowship is a wonderful way to do that. So I believe there was a link shared. They will share it in the chat. We can also share it in the follow-up email. If you know clergy people, if you know lay leaders, please let them know about this opportunity. It's always wonderful. I hope you are ambassadors of this interreligious learning, that just like me, you continue to have a passion about these topics. And thank you for allowing me to share a little bit about Mary. Like I said, I couldn't do justice to her. But I hope that we, continue our journey together, and that I will see you at different occasions. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed being with you. Thank you for your willingness to learn and listen, and connecting with other people in the room. Thank you so much. I hope to see you on other occasions.